Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jeremy, and I'm leading tonight's session and last week's session. And our topic that we're focusing on is the practice of compassion, as it's presented in the Buddhist tradition. We didn't get to talk too much about compassion last week, so we'll focus more explicitly on that tonight. I thought I had 3 weeks to cover this material, but there was some mix-up with our scheduling, so I've got only tonight. So we'll see how we go covering everything that we were hoping to cover. So we'll start off by doing some meditation. And last week we did a meditation which is a concentration meditation, which means focusing your mind on a single object, single neutral object. So we'll start off by doing that again, focusing on our breath. And then we'll do an analytical meditation, which means focusing on a series of points or ideas to reach a conclusion. So we'll be focusing on firstly the idea of equanimity, which is seeing all beings as equal, which is the basis of the practice of compassion. And so then we'll meditate on the causes for developing compassion, so the things that you need to focus on in order to give rise to the attitude of compassion. Okay, so we'll start off by sitting in a comfortable posture and just relax your body and mind firstly. And just stop thinking about all the things that you've been preoccupied with during the day. Try to stop that train of thought. And then bring your attention to your breath and observe your breath moving in and out. So the idea is that without using too much force, you place your mind on the object of concentration, which in this case is the breath, and merely observe the sensation of the breath moving in and out through your nostrils. So we use mindfulness to remember the object of concentration, which is the breath. So to keep that object in mind. And alertness is observing the concentration to see whether your mind wanders, and then to bring it back if it does. So the whole process should be relaxed and comfortable and not forced. You can think of your mind as being very, very vast and expansive, like the sky. So try to keep your concentration on that point for the duration of 9 breaths. So breathing in and out is 1 breath. So once we have calmed our minds by focusing on this object single-pointedly, this neutral object, so this helps to pacify the discursive thoughts and makes it easier to focus on the analytical meditation. So as I said, the analytical meditation is on the idea of equanimity. So this idea is that on the fundamental level, all beings are equal. For example, we are all the same in wanting to be happy and trying to avoid problems. So we firstly focus on this idea that I, myself, and all other beings are the same in this fundamental aspect, this fundamental experience of wanting to be happy and trying to avoid various kinds of problems. So you think about how most of our activities are motivated by this wish, the wish to achieve happiness, and all the things that we do trying to achieve that goal, and all the things we do to try and avoid experiencing problems. So you think about how all the other beings around you, for example, the people in this room, are all the same in trying to achieve this, in trying to do this. So by doing this analysis, we give rise to the feeling that I and others are the same in this fundamental aspect. So rather than seeing yourself as being very different, and seeing some people as being pleasant and some as unpleasant, and some as good and some as bad, we focus on this shared experience. So you develop a kind of sense of affinity or closeness with others, thinking how all beings have this same fundamental aspect, the same wish, the same goal. So then you focus your mind on this feeling. Again, we use concentration meditation to focus on that feeling or that conclusion that I and all others are equal in this fundamental aspect. So that's the mind of equanimity, or the attitude of equanimity, and that serves as the foundation or basis upon which we develop compassion. So we develop compassion by firstly thinking how, even though I and all beings, all other beings, are striving for happiness and trying to avoid problems, still we are unable to achieve the complete happiness that we are striving for, and unable to completely avoid the problems that we're trying to avoid. So we're still experiencing various problems, difficulties, etc. So you think about all the various problems that people are experiencing, such as physical problems and emotional problems, relationship problems, financial problems. You can think firstly of the various problems that you experience and think about how all others are experiencing similar problems to yourself. So you can think firstly of people that you know, who you are close to, and the various problems, difficulties that they are experiencing. And then extend it out to include more people. And then try to make it as expansive as possible to include firstly all the beings, for example, in this room, and then in this city, and this country, and in the whole world. And then also the non-humans, the animals. So then we develop the attitude of compassion further by not just being aware of others' problems and sufferings, but developing the wish that they be free of those. So you think how wonderful it would be if those beings could be free of those problems. So you could visualize them becoming free, so those problems just disappearing, just evaporating. And then we make the mind of compassion even stronger by taking some personal responsibility, thinking, I will help those beings to be free from their problems. By taking some personal responsibility, thinking, I will do whatever I can to help others to be free of their problems and to be happy. Then we can make this feeling stronger by visualizing that light is radiating out from our body to all the beings around us. So you can start with the people in this room or the people who you are closest to in your life, and visualize that this light completely fills their body and mind and removes all of their problems, physical, mental, emotional, relationship, financial, etc. Completely removes those problems. And again, you try to extend this out to include as many beings as possible. So you just focus your mind single-pointedly on this visualization, again using mindfulness and alertness. Just keep your mind placed on that visualization of the light coming out from you, going out to all other beings. Okay, just end the meditation there. So how did you go with that? Are there any questions or comments about that meditation before we move on? There's quite a lot in that meditation. I realise it's kind of a compacted version of the meditation practice on compassion, but I think you get the idea of an analytical meditation through that. So the idea of focusing on a series of analysis or points and reasons, and then arriving at a conclusion. For example, the idea that we're all fundamentally equal in our shared experience. So maybe I could ask you, what do you think about the idea of equanimity? Do you agree with that analysis? You don't have to agree. Do you feel like all beings are fundamentally equal in that regard? Does anyone disagree? So that's, I think you can see how that creates a level basis. So the idea of the meditation on equanimity is to remove this feeling of holding some people close and others distant, and seeing some people as very nice and other people as unpleasant, seeing some people as good, others as bad. So that sort of very judgmental attitude, which sees those good and bad qualities in people as being somehow inherently good and bad from their side. So another part of the meditation on equanimity is to see how those qualities that we see in other people are projections of our mind, and those qualities are based on how those people make us feel. So the people who make us feel good are the ones that we label pleasant and nice, and the ones that we feel close to. Whereas the people who harm us or offend us or we find unpleasant, we label bad. And also to notice how those labels can easily change. So the person who you previously labelled unpleasant or enemy or someone that you don't want to be close to, how that can change because of something they do. And vice versa, the person you labelled nice can quickly change into someone you label as not nice because of change of circumstances. So it's to see that how those labels are impermanent and can change easily, to try and break down those concrete categories of good and bad, good people, bad people, pleasant, unpleasant, and try to develop that attitude of equanimity. And then based on that, you can see how it's much easier to firstly develop affinity with other people and see how they are similar to us and they're experiencing the same kinds of problems as we are. So develop that kind of affinity, that they're a sort of kindred spirit. And then to go further, to have that wish how good it would be if they could be free of their problems and have the happiness that they are striving for. In the same way as we have that feeling for ourselves, how good it would be if I could be completely free of all my problems and difficulties and achieve perfect, happiness, to have that same wish for others. So that's the idea. It's a gradual process of developing from equanimity to compassion, and then to taking on some personal responsibility and wish that I will do something to help others to achieve what they want. Okay. So excuse my computer, I couldn't get to a printer today, so I'll just keep tapping away here. My screen keeps going black, so I have to keep tapping. Okay. So last week I was trying to make the case that true and lasting happiness is not found in external things, as in things that are external to the mind. And I'm not sure whether you're convinced by that argument, but so this is as I was saying, kind of like the basis of spiritual practice, the idea that to achieve the lasting, reliable, sort of completely, to achieve the happiness that we're striving for, we need to look within the mind. Okay, that's the idea. So if you accept that argument that you can't find the true happiness in external things, that they're not going to be able to deliver the true happiness that you're looking for, so then the next question is, where do you find that? And so in Buddhism and other spiritual traditions, they're saying you have to look within the mind. And from the Buddhist point of view, and I think in many other spiritual traditions, compassion is said to be the most powerful way, the most powerful practice, or the most powerful attitude for achieving happiness. So that's an interesting idea. Because I think perhaps when we first hear of the idea of compassion, where you're focusing your mind on others' welfare instead of on yourself, then you might feel, that you're abandoning your concern for yourself and thinking of others, and how could that fulfill me? That seems to be somehow neglecting myself. And I've got enough problems of my own, why would I want to focus on everyone else's problems? So how is it that compassion could be, the true cause of happiness? So in the Buddhist presentation, and I think this is a very important and profound observation, that most of our problems can be traced back to this attitude of, let's call it self-centeredness. So what I mean by self-centeredness here is the idea that the self, I, is the most important thing in the universe, in my universe. It's sometimes called selfishness, but I think selfishness can sound a bit kind of pejorative, a bit like, labelling you bad. So it's not about saying that you're bad for having self-centeredness. It's just pointing out that self-centeredness, that attitude, is causing you a lot of problems and is not bringing you what you want. So I think it's a very interesting and probably, I think, also challenging idea. And that I think for me, when I first encountered that kind of idea, I immediately felt that, I was being told that I had to sort of give up my happiness in order to, and just focus on others. But actually it's the opposite. And the Dalai Lama sometimes uses the term intelligent selfishness. So he describes compassion as intelligent selfishness. He says if you really want to be happy, the best way is to focus on looking after others' welfare, to stop this sort of obsessive, self-centered attitude, and to think about others instead. So we need to, I think, examine that idea and check whether it makes sense. And it's important to understand that it's not saying there's anything wrong with taking care of yourself, looking after yourself, physically and emotionally. There's nothing wrong with having high self-esteem, having good feeling about your capabilities, your good qualities. So it's more about, and I think we need to be clear about this, it's the idea of sort of just focusing on this one person and to this sort of exclusion of others. So I think a useful way of thinking of this is to think about the various problems that we experience and whether they arise from self-centeredness. So, for example, the various afflictive emotions that arise. So, anger, for example. So you can see how anger arises from a strong sense of I. So first we have, I want this, I want things to be a certain way, I want people to treat me in a certain way, and then when that doesn't happen, when people treat me, in a different way, then anger arises. So someone disrespects me when they're driving the car and they cut me off on the road, make a rude sign or whatever, showing me disrespect. So then the strong feeling of I arises. How dare you disrespect me in that way? Who do you think you are? Those kind of thoughts arising. So all coming from a strong sense of I. And then also other afflictive emotions like attachment, strongly wanting something for me. So you see something really desirable and you just have a strong feeling I've got to have that. And that, and the various problems that arise from attachment. So like anxiety, for example, I think arises from strong attachment. So if you're strongly attached to something, then necessarily you're going to have strong anxiety about that thing being taken away from you. So, that can even be something like your image of yourself. We invest in a certain image, trying to create a certain kind of image of ourselves, and then when that is threatened, then strong anger or anxiety can arise. So any thoughts on that? Does that sound like a good diagnosis? A good explanation? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. 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 Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah, I think that's a very good example of this idea. So it's not to say that there's that you are doing anything wrong or bad. It's just the idea that if we can get out of the focus on oneself and our particular problem that we have, whatever it is, and we can get out of that by focusing on other people's welfare. So it's actually a way of liberating your mind from that problem. So I think that's very good. So whether it's grief or anxiety or depression or even relationship problem. So by identifying how this problem is arising and somehow created by that strong focus on me and my situation, and seeing how we can get out of that by focusing on others. Yeah. So that's a very good example. So I think it's helpful to think about the various difficulties that we experience and to identify how this attitude of self-centeredness is playing a role in creating those problems. So then, if that is the case, if self-centeredness is one of the fundamental causes of these problems, then you can see how compassion becomes very important, and that how the practice of compassion is actually firstly very beneficial for oneself. You're the main beneficiary of that practice. So then how do we give rise to compassion? So as we were saying, the practice is firstly to develop the mind of equanimity, by removing these concrete barriers of seeing others as good and bad, and also of identifying your own experience. So sometimes it's taught that firstly we need to have compassion for ourselves in order before we can have compassion for others. So I think what that means is firstly being aware of the various problems that we experience. So we need to be aware of those, and then identifying how others around us are experiencing basically or very similar things. So that develops this feeling of affinity, feeling that you're close to others, that they're sharing this fundamental experience with you. And then building on that to this feeling of, how great it would be if they could be free from those various problems. And then again, taking responsibility. I will do something to free them. So in Buddhism they talk about the bodhisattva path. So this is the wish that I will become a Buddha, or develop my mind to the most perfect extent, so that I am in the best position to help other beings. So the idea is not that you get enlightened in order just to make yourself as happy as possible, but you do it only because you want to benefit others. So you can see how that is a very kind of broad and expansive view of the world and of life, to think of all beings around you and how I want to, improve my mind for their benefit. And it's interesting to sort of experiment with that idea, even doing breathing meditation. Firstly, doing it with the motivation, I just want to be happy myself and calm my mind down, compared to the motivation of thinking, I want to do this so that I can benefit, perhaps firstly the people in your life, like your family and friends, so that I can be more helpful for them, and then expand that out so that I can be more helpful for all beings. So I think maybe you can see how that's like a very vast, expansive attitude, compared to the opposite, where you're just thinking about my problem and all the various difficulties I'm experiencing. Yeah. Okay. Sometimes when I'm talking about this, I'm wondering, do you feel like we have, lots of problems? I think sometimes people complain about Buddhists. You guys just talking about problems all the time, Maybe the Buddhists are creating problems just by thinking about them too much. Just forget about the problems. So that's something to check up. The Buddhist view is that actually every moment of our experience is in some way problematic. But the good side is that those problems have causes. So by identifying what the causes are, for example, self-centeredness, that we can remove the causes of those problems, and then we can show others how to do the same.
How do we get to show up as women and stop to resist? I don't understand what
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that because you probably find that, when you decide, okay, I'm going to try and be helpful to others, that usually it doesn't go very well when you first. I think a lot of people, they would just resent being helped because I didn't ask for your help, I don't want your help, and it's kind of presumptuous of you to try and be helping me. So I think we have to be very careful and very skillful, and for that reason it's taught that actually we need to become enlightened or develop our wisdom before we can skillfully help people, in a real way. So so if people are resistant, then probably I would say just either try and find some other way of helping. Like I think, for example, with children, and you're rearing children, and you're trying to help them by giving them good advice, but often they're resistant to that, they reject it. So then you've got to try and think of another way of communicating that information to them in a way that will be effective. Yeah. So it takes a lot of skill, I think, to actually help people. But we still have to try, I think.
In my experience, it's not the small children, it's the big ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Small ones that don't have the mind.
That's right, yeah. So we're all very complex beings, and I think actually eventually, and the Buddha said this often, that it's only, you can only help yourself. So the Buddha said, I can't take away your problems, by washing them away. I can only teach you how to take away your own problems. So for that reason he manifested as a teacher rather than as a doctor or so he said, the best way I can help you is by teaching you how to understand your own mind and to identify the causes of your suffering and to remove them through meditation. Because these causes, the fundamental causes, are all in your mind, not anywhere else. So we have to find them, what it is in there. Yeah. And then that would also serve as a motivation for, improving your own wisdom and your own good qualities. And, for example, teaching by example. So rather than telling people they have to be compassionate, to actually practice compassion yourself and to show them how practice of compassion is useful and powerful, I think. And someone was asking me last week about, we have these meditational deities that appear as very wrathful and scary. Like we have Tara here and Chenrezig, and they're said to be like peaceful deities. And then you have these other really scary looking ones holding various weapons and fangs and things like that. So this is also the idea that compassion can come in many forms. So sometimes compassion can be wrathful. Again, example with children. So if a child is about to run on the road, then the parent might scream at them and scare the hell out of them in order to get them to freeze and not run onto the road. So that would be an example of wrathful compassion. And there's some Buddhist teachers who use a lot of wrathful compassion, can be quite ferocious. And I think the idea is that it's not to make you miserable, it's to sort of subdue, for example, pride. So if you have a lot of pride, and then someone is sort of manifesting as very wrathful and sort of scary, then the pride is diminished. And also if someone's mind is very aggressive, then to approach them with being very peaceful and kind could just make them more angry. You might have encountered people like that. So you might be better off just coming back at them with a lot of ferociousness, and then that sort of has more benefit for their mind. Yes?
Do you find, if you meditate on compassion, often then it helps with things like compassion fatigue, where you might not feel like you have those reserves to do others?
Yeah, I think so I think compassion is something that arises in dependence upon generating these causes that we talked about. For example, reminding ourselves of other people's difficulties and how they're experiencing the same thing as we are. So we need to be reminded of those things, because our tendency is to forget and tend to think that we are, and become more focused on the self and the I, and tend to forget about how other people are experiencing the same thing. So I guess the idea of compassion fatigue is overcome by this process of familiarising your mind with these causes of compassion. So we keep going back to them, and that's why there's emphasis on regular, daily meditation, and eventually making it part of your way of thinking. So you're constantly, whenever you meet someone, then you're immediately thinking about, what's their experience, what's going on for them, what are the challenges, problems they're facing. So it becomes sort of habitual and part of your way of thinking. Yeah, but again, I think we also have to be realistic, and that we can't become these kind of saintly bodhisattvas overnight and feel compassion for everyone. there's still going to be people who really annoy us, and we can't feel, no matter how hard we try, we can't feel compassionate for them. And so then you just got to be realistic. So you do as much as you can, and then you can have a break, and then you come back. Maybe spend some time with that really difficult person until you can't handle it anymore. Then you can back off. So you've got to be realistic, and it's a gradual process. Yep. So I just wanted to also emphasize the idea that the practice of compassion is not asking you to give up anything. So I think we tend to have a sort of fearful thought that if I live my life compassionately and focus on others' welfare, that I'm being asked to give up my own happiness, sacrifice my own happiness for others. And I remember I used to think that, that compassionate people were these amazing people who decided to sacrifice their own happiness and just work for others' happiness, and just put up with their own problems, their own suffering. But actually, when you start to practice compassion, I think you quickly realize that this approach is very beneficial for your own mind. And you immediately start to feel happier because you're freeing your mind from this kind of self-imposed prison, I guess, of self-centeredness. So immediately your whole attitude becomes, expansive, and your whole world becomes much more open. The idea of becoming like a friend to the world is some epithet for the Buddha. So instead of seeing, some beings as a threat and other beings as someone you could get something from, and putting everyone into these categories of, that person's nice, I want to get closer to them, and that person's unpleasant, I want to push them away. This kind of constant exhausting battle going on in our mind. We're trying to negotiate the world and control it. You have a much more expansive view where you can accept everyone as being sort of like the same as you, and then feeling how your attitude towards them is, how can I help them, rather than what can I get from them or how can I push them away, sort of thing. I think that's the idea. And I think also you can see how the mind of being very strongly self-centered makes your mind very, what's the word? I guess maybe fragile or very easily upset, because you're sort of reducing the tolerances of your mind. So if you're very focused on I and what I wants, and rejecting anything that's not in accordance with what the I wants, so trying to control the world around you so that it is in that way, so that that whole world is kind of favourable to how this I wants it to be. And you can see how that's actually futile, because most of the world is uncontrollable, particularly the other people in our world. We have very limited control over them, and they're going to behave how they want to. So by focusing, I want things to be this way. For example, I want everyone to treat me with respect. Having that thought is unrealistic, because there's going to be many people who don't treat you with respect. So we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and frustration and pain if we have that expectation. That I deserve everyone to respect me, and they should do that, and I'm going to try and force them to do that. This is unrealistic, and setting yourself up for a lot of pain and suffering and stress and depression. Whereas the opposite thought is, all other beings are experiencing various problems, and the way that they treat me is a manifestation of the various problems that they're experiencing. And so they're very much the same as me in this regard. And so my attitude is going to be to understand their situation and do what I can, or at least have the thought that I understand their suffering and I feel for them, and I'd like to do something if I can. But you can see how that's a very opposite approach, and how one brings a lot of problems and the other one is solving a lot of those problems. Okay. So that's kind of the practice of compassion in a nutshell. And so the main point I wanted to communicate to you is to firstly identify, what this self-centered attitude is, and to see how it serves as the cause of various problems that we experience, particularly the emotional problems, and to identify how compassion is the solution to those problems. And again, as I was saying last week, we don't have to accept this idea. It's something that the Buddha just said, this is my idea, so you can take it or leave it. This is what I've found through my meditation. So I suggest that you go away and check it out and see whether it works. And we can sort of be scientific about it and investigate it. Is self-cherishing, self-centeredness, do we have that? Is that our main way of thinking? And is that giving rise to these problems? For example, you think of the various problems you have, whether anger arising or anxiety. I often feel stressed about work, and think about how that arises from self-cherishing, self-centeredness. Firstly, does that arise? Is that caused by self-centeredness? Work-related stress. So you think about what is work-related stress. So it's a kind of like a fear or anxiety. That things are going to go wrong, that you're going to get blamed for something, that you can't keep up with the workload. That people are going to think you're incompetent or lazy. These kind of feelings give rise to work-related stress, I think. And work-related stress is a very common problem. I think most people who work experience that. So how is that related to self-centeredness? So think, for example, the fear of people thinking that you're incompetent or lazy. That's a form of pride, I think. And again, I'm not saying it's pride in a negative way. It's just a feeling that you want everyone to respect you and think well of you. You want, when they think of you, you want them to think, oh, that person's competent, they're trying hard, they're a good person. We want them on our team. That's what you want people to think about you. And so we're fearful that they're not thinking that. So that gives rise to this kind of anxiety. And sort of terrified that maybe people might start to think that we're, incompetent, or maybe terrified's a bit strong word, but we do have that kind of fear, I think, often at the back of our minds. And that's where this kind of stress and fear arises. So you can see how that arises from the strong sense of I. I want everyone to respect me. I want everyone to feel good about me. I. The Dalai Lama often makes this comment that there was some research done that he quotes where there was analysis, people's speech were analysed, and the people who used the words I and me the most often were showing much higher rates of heart disease. So he cites that as a good example of how the attitude converts into the language, and then that also is having effect physically. So heart disease can, I think, often related back to stress and raised blood pressure and things like that. I think there's a saying in Tibetan, the people something like, be careful of people who use I and me a lot in their sentences. So it's sort of an indication that people who use that perhaps are focused strongly on themselves. I think that, I want this, you're not treating me properly, and it's sort of you can see how that's self-centered, perhaps, language. Again, that's something I think we need to investigate. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to talk about tonight. So hopefully I've communicated those points clearly. Hopefully I've convinced you that your problems are mostly are fundamentally caused by self-centeredness, and that the best antidote to self-centeredness is to practice compassion, and that we can practice compassion by following those gradual steps of equanimity, identifying how others are suffering, and generating the wish to free them from suffering. Also, a cause of compassion is to meditate on the benefits of compassion and the faults of self-centeredness, which is what we've been talking about tonight. So that in itself is said to be a cause of the mind of compassion, understanding that. Dalai Lama also said that there's no logical reason why you would cherish yourself or think of your own welfare as more important than others. So that's an interesting idea. Like from a purely rational point of view, if you're purely approaching life rationally, then you wouldn't focus just on this one being, because this one being is just one person, whereas all other beings are countless. So there's no rational reason. Also, it doesn't bring happiness. It's focusing on this self is causing problems. So that's not a good reason to focus on this self instead of others. So he's saying there's no good reason to do it. So again, that's something we need to investigate ourselves and check out whether that's true. Okay, so I hope that's not too overwhelming, but it's something to think about. And so next time you experience a problem, maybe ask yourself that question, is this arising from self-centeredness? And would the practice of compassion help to solve this problem? So just encourage you to investigate that idea. Okay, so any more questions before we finish up? Comments? So I think Damien will be teaching from next week, and he will be talking about similar themes, I think. So if you think about this during the week and come up with questions, and you can give them to Damien next week. So thank you for your time, and feel free to stay for tea and cake if hopefully there's some there.